This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Dan and Amy, I think I found my favorite internet meme from the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. There are many.
Yes,
you see,
there are.
you see Chris Christie in his beach chair. I've seen that one next to Trump and Kim Jong-un.
Oh, yeah.
But the one is just a picture of Kim Jong-un and Trump standing before the flags on the dais, and the caption is, "When you're almost done picking teams in gym class." It's pretty good. Pretty
There's
good.
There's a bond there, and Father's Day's coming up, and maybe President Trump's going to get a Father's Day card from Kim Jong-un.
Well,
I know he has his own father, but he was a very father-esque figure for him.
Trump was very complimentary throughout, including in an interview yesterday with Clinton Foundation donor Zero, George Stephanopoulos. First of all, he laid out what has been accomplished in his estimation.
It got done. I think it's a terrific document. It's a starter, but it's a terrific document. I think far more. And there are things that we negotiated after that document that are also very important. They're going to get rid of certain ballistic missile sites and various other things. We're going to put that out later. But we have the framework of getting ready to denuclearize North Korea.
And
which was his, kind of all or nothing demand. I mean, the framework for denuclearization. Now, there is there's at least one point of controversy. This has been the subject of some criticism of Trump from conservatives, such as those over at National Review, and that was his announcement that he'll be stopping the so-called war games with the South Koreans.
Yeah, military exercises. That took the president of South Korea by surprise, and many lawmakers.
Trump said this about that.
Did you talk about pulling troops out, U.S. troops
We
out
didn't
of South
discuss
Korea?
that, no, but we're not going to play the war games. I wanted to stop the war games. I thought they were very provocative, but I also think they're very expensive.
Now he's worried about money?
Well, the issue of the joint exercises and whether or not he's being too congenial, whether or not that constitutes a concession from America with only the promise of a move in the direction of denuclearization from the North Koreans, empty promises potentially that we've experienced before. So that has been the subject of some criticism. And then also just how he talks about Kim Jong-un is another area of criticism. So, for example, this.
His country does love him, his people. You see the fervor. They have a great fervor. They're going to put it together, and I think they're going to end up with a very strong country, and a country which has people that they're so hardworking, so industrious. I think if you look at South Korea someday, maybe in the not-too-distant future, it will be something like that.
Those are called propaganda videos that he was maybe watching where, they come out.
Well, they have
cheering him on and supporting him.
Yeah, there's a fervor because it's a fervor at the point of a gun.
Conform or die thing.
And I understand this is just part of what you have to accept with Trump, but it still is a little bit difficult to assimilate. We are talking about the third in a line of three generations of brutal dictators that have enslaved their people, murdered political opponents, and anybody they're mad at, kidnapped and murdered out of warm beer, lest we forget.
Yeah, that was a year anniversary, too, to the day of his release from North Korea.
Nevertheless, Trump says there is a connection that's been made, and he trusts Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un trusts him.
You trust him?
I do trust him, yeah. Now, will I come back to you in a year and you'll be interviewing? I'll say, gee, I made a mistake. That's always possible. So, we're dealing at a very high level. A lot of things can change. A lot of things are possible. He trusts me, I believe. I really do. I mean, he said openly, and he said it to a couple of reporters that were with him, that he knows that no other president ever could have done this. I mean, he knows the presidents. He knows who we had in front of me. He said no other president could have done this. I think he trusts me, and I trust him.
It's difficult to know who is more complimentary, Dennis Rodman or Donald Trump. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Dean Cheng, who is a senior research fellow for Asian Studies, National Security, and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Dean, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
What about the criticism coming from the likes of David French and Michael Brendan Doherty at National Review that effectively he offered concessions, he sort of naively or Norman Vincent Peale, in his Norman Vincent Peale-esque way, took Kim Jong-un at his word, and that has made it more difficult to keep the pressure on the North Korean regime that we need to keep?
Well, when we look at the actual joint document that came out, there's very little in the way of actual concessions here. It says that the two sides are committed to peace. We've always known that. The U.S. side certainly has been. That they will work towards denuclearization. That's certainly not a concession on the part of the U.S. There's nothing there about eliminating or removing sanctions. That's very important. Now, where I think that there has been a lot of discussion, and I look forward to hearing from Secretary of State Pompeo and Secretary of Defense Mattis, is exactly what is it that the President talked about with the North Koreans and promised to do about our joint military exercises with the South Koreans. When he said that we are going to freeze military war games, what did he mean? Because that could be a major concession.
Well, do you think, though, that it was a first, introduction, though, or do you think he gave away too much by signing that document?
Well, I think that once you agreed to have a face-to-face meeting with the North Koreans, that something like this was probably going to emerge. And let's be upfront. If something like this didn't emerge, if they had simply walked out, waved at the audience, sort of shook hands, and that was it, you would see the press right now saying basically that President Trump squandered an opportunity for improving relations. To be honest, my concerns were more at the other end. Would we emerge with a fairly detailed document that would outline how the U.S. would suspend sanctions, how the U.S. would extend aid, how the U.S. would do all sorts of things for the promise of North Korean denuclearization?
Yeah, and the perspective of Beijing on this, what do you think Beijing is thinking in the wake of the document that did come out of the meeting and the rhetoric from both sides?
Well, Beijing has first and foremost wanted to make sure there isn't a war on the peninsula, and I think that it is reassured in this regard. Unfortunately, I think that, again, looking at the promise of suspending war games, I think Beijing comes out of this thinking, hey, we got pretty much what we were hoping for, which is the freeze for a freeze. The U.S. halts its military war games. North Korea, at least nominally, halts its nuclear and missile program. The problem has always been we're not really sure whether, for example, the lull in North Korean nuclear and missile tests is them deciding not to do things, or is it, I've already finished all the tests that I needed to do for the moment, so I'm going to announce a suspension that doesn't really mean much.
Well, right, and Trump in that interview with Stephanopoulos mentioned that, and this, of course, not in the document, but mentioned that Kim Jong-un communicated to him that he was destroying ballistic missile testing sites and was open to doing more of that. It's tough to kind of verify, obviously, what was said between the two, but that was something that Trump suggested.
True, but the flip side to that is North Koreans have promised all sorts of things. And while I'm glad that the president says that he trusts North Korea and that North Korea trusts him, unfortunately, the track record here, if you were to put it in terms of credit ratings, I think North Korea would score somewhere in the low hundreds.
Right.
What do you think for what this means for China? Do you think there are winners in all this? Because they've wanted all along those military exercises to cease.
Well, it certainly helps with them. It opens the way for them to stop enforcing the sanctions that they did impose, and that is really going to be the biggest problem for us, because it is the Chinese crackdown on the North Koreans that probably has brought more pressure to bear on North Korea than anything we've done directly. So if the Chinese take this opportunity to reopen the floodgates, President Trump may find that his negotiating position has very rapidly evaporated. So this is really going to come then down to how do the U.S. and China interact to keep the pressure on North Korea in the coming months and year.
Do you think this meeting was a good idea in the first place? There were some analysts who suggested that legitimizing the legitimizing effect of the President of the United States meeting with Kim Jong-un was a mistake from the outset?
I would certainly say that this has been an unprecedented approach. President Trump basically, it seems, decided on his own, hey, they said they want a meeting, I'm going to go ahead with the meeting. That's not normally how these sorts of summits proceed. We had the moment when Kim Jong-un was sufficiently bellicose that President Trump said, all right, fine, I'm suspending it. That means that it's a good question just how much of the prep work, how much of the staff work was accomplished in what was almost certainly an incredibly short amount of time for a first-time summit between these two leaders.
And
it's a good question, and I'm afraid only time will tell whether this was a good idea or not.
Yeah, speaking of time, how long is it going to take before things get rolling? I mean, President Trump's like, oh, it'll start immediately, but denuclearization could take, 5-10 years?
Again, our concept of denuclearization has always been for them to get rid of all their nuclear weapons, nuclear facilities, nuclear material. That should take a very long time. The North Korean version of denuclearization, we actually still don't know what each side means by that term. It included the U.S. ending its nuclear commitment to South Korea, ideally withdrawing American forces from South Korea. So we've got a lot of ways to go just in figuring out what each side means. And into that confusing mix, we now have the question, what does President Trump think he achieved when he says, I got the North Koreans to denuclearize? Because his understanding of the term may not fully align with long-standing U.S. policy, and certainly, it's a good question whether it's the same as what the North Koreans mean.
One of the imponderables, it seems, is just what the sort of economic stability of the North Korean regime is at present. And there's some suggestion that, Trump was doing his real estate developer pitch with Kim Jong-un about what North Korea could be and the beautiful beaches and all that. But
water parks.
The possibility of the need, if not the desire, to economically liberalize, to prop up the regime. And does that provide an opportunity to essentially trade economic vitality in North Korea in exchange for denuclearization? We had Admiral James Stavridis on yesterday, and he put the prospects of actually getting North Korea on the path to denuclearization at like 70-30, which is one of the more optimistic estimates I've heard.
Well, in terms of economic liberalization, I think that we need to be very clear that from Kim Jong-un's perspective, economic liberalization is not necessarily a good thing. He has much more control over his population than your average dictator does. This is a Stalinist-level regime. So opening things up, allowing more trade, allowing more business to occur, means that you're creating alternative power centers within North Korea, many of which will not have little or no loyalty to the Kim family. A businessman who is wealthy and has enough to eat and can do that without reference to Kim Jong-un is somebody who, in a sense, can call his own shot. Is that really something Kim Jong-un wants? His father and his grandfather, the Chinese have said, listen, you need to liberalize. And they consistently rejected it. And, the Chinese aren't saying you should politically liberalize. They were talking about economic liberalization. So I find it hard to believe that Kim Jong-un is going to be open to that, much less by trading away his nuclear capabilities that serve multiple purposes, not least of which, again, is keeping him in power.
But the flip side is he also sees that Trump has no interest in doing an Obama-style Iranian nuclear deal where you dump $150 billion into the country. And so how does he get the resources he needs? Just trying to get sanctions that are currently imposed in North Korea eased?
Well, if sanctions were removed, the sources of investment and money into North Korea wouldn't come from the United States, at least if you were Kim Jong-un. The first place you'd actually go to would be South Korea. And President Moon of South Korea has been much more open to renewing economic ties across the DMZ alongside political relaxation. The next source might be China. The Chinese might be interested in making money through North Korea, but keeping in mind that the Chinese have their own reasons for keeping Kim Jong-un on a short leash. So before he comes knocking at the doors of Wall Street and the White House for aid, he's more likely to knock at the doors of the Blue House in South Korea and Zhongnanhai in Beijing.
He is Dean Cheng, Senior Research Fellow for Asian Studies, National Security, and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Dean, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's News